The weight of an empty box, a story of betrayal, grief, and the peace that comes after he sold my late mother's engagement ring for gambling money. He lost the ring forever, but he lost something even greater, my trust. I walked away, rebuilt my life, and discovered that peace was worth more than any diamond. This isn't a story about a ring. It's a story about the exact moment you stop mistaking silence for peace, and what it costs to finally tell the truth about your own life. Stay till the end, because the woman I became after that empty box is not the woman who opened it. I found the box before I found the words for what it meant. It was a Tuesday, unremarkable in every way except that it was the anniversary of my mother's death, and I had gone looking for her ring the way I did every year on that date, not to wear it, never to wear it, because it lived in the top drawer of our bedroom dresser wrapped in the same soft blue cloth she'd kept it in for 30 years, but to hold it. To sit on the edge of the bed and turn it in the light the way she used to, and remember, for 10 quiet minutes, that some things survive the people who loved them. The box was there. The blue cloth was there, folded exactly the way I always folded it back. But when I opened the box, it was empty. It isn't the empty of a room nobody's in. It isn't the empty of a house after the movers leave. It's the empty of reaching for something you have never once, in your entire adult life, doubted would be there, and finding only the shape it used to occupy. My name is Josephine Hartwell, Josie, to anyone who's known me longer than a handshake, and I was 34 years old, married 4 years to a man named Daniel Mercer, sitting on the edge of our shared bed on the anniversary of my mother's death, holding an empty velvet box, when I first understood, with a clarity that arrived far too late to be useful, that something in my marriage had already ended, and I simply hadn't been informed yet. I called Daniel at his office. He didn't pick up the first time. He didn't pick up the second time either, which was, in itself, unusual. Daniel answered his phone the way most people answer a doorbell, reflexively, without checking who it was first, a habit I'd always found sweetly attentive and would come, in the following weeks, to understand rather differently. He called back 40 minutes later, and I could hear, in the specific too careful evenness of his voice, that he already knew why I was calling. "Hey," he said. "Everything okay? Where's my mother's ring, Daniel?" There was a silence on the line long enough that I could hear the specific ambient hum of his office, the copier down the hall, someone laughing at something 2 cubicles over, the ordinary sounds of a Tuesday continuing for everyone in the world except me. "I can explain," he said, which is, I have since learned, one of the 4 or 5 sentences in the English language that has never once preceded an actual explanation worth hearing. "Then explain." "Not over the phone," he said. "I'll be home at 6. I'll explain everything. Josie, I need you to not panic. It's not what you think." I sat on the edge of our bed for the next 4 hours, the empty box in my lap, and did the specific, useless mental math of a woman trying to imagine every possible innocent explanation for a missing engagement ring, and finding, with each passing hour, that the list of innocent explanations grew shorter and the list of the other kind grew longer, until by 5:30 I had stopped trying to imagine anything at all, and simply sat, waiting, in the particular stillness of someone bracing for a wave they can already see coming. To understand what that ring meant, you have to understand my mother, Eleanor Hartwell, and the particular shape of the life she'd built out of very little. She raised me alone from the time I was 6, after my father left in the specific, unremarkable way fathers sometimes do, not dramatically, not with a scene, just gradually, a series of missed weekends that eventually stopped being missed and started simply being absent. My mother worked 2 jobs for most of my childhood, days at a dental office, evenings doing the books for a small hardware store 2 streets over, and somewhere in the exhausted middle of all that, she still managed to make our small apartment feel, consistently, like the safest place in the world. The ring had been my grandfather's gift to my grandmother in 1958, a modest diamond in a modest gold setting, nothing spectacular by any objective jeweler's standard, but it had survived 2 generations of women who'd needed, at various points in their lives, to sell literally everything else they owned and had chosen, every single time, to keep this instead. "It's not about the diamond," my mother told me once, when I was 17 and asked her why she'd never sold it during one of our leaner years, when I knew for a fact we'd gone 2 winters without a working furnace. "It's about the fact that your grandmother kept it through things that would have made most people sell it twice over. Every time I've been tempted, I think about her keeping it anyway, and I understand that it isn't really a ring anymore. It's proof that our family survives things. I want you to have that proof someday. Not to wear. Just to have." She died when I was 28, quickly and unfairly, the way cancer sometimes moves through people who spent their whole lives being too busy keeping everyone else afloat to take proper care of themselves. In the very last week, when she could still speak in full sentences, she made me promise one thing, holding my hand in a hospital bed that smelled like antiseptic and wilting flowers. "Keep the ring," she said. "Not for the money. For the proof." I promised her. I meant it the way you mean things at a deathbed, which is to say completely, with your whole chest, in a way that feels less like a promise and more like a fact about the rest of your life. I remember, too, a smaller conversation from years before that hospital room, one I hadn't thought about in a long time until the box turned up empty. I was 22, freshly graduated, dating a man my mother had never quite warmed to, and I'd asked her, half joking, whether she thought I should give the ring to him someday, have the stone reset into something of our own. She'd gone very quiet, in the specific way she did when she was choosing her next words carefully. "That ring isn't a decision you make because you're excited about someone, Josie. It's a decision you make because you've watched someone, for a long time, in the small unglamorous moments, and you've seen enough to trust what you saw. Your grandfather wasn't a rich man. He wasn't even, by most accounts, a particularly romantic one. But he was consistent, in a way that mattered more than either of those things. Don't give that ring to excitement. Give it, someday, to consistency, if you're lucky enough to find it." I hadn't understood, at 22, how prophetic that piece of advice would turn out to be. I understood it considerably better 12 years later, sitting on the edge of my bed with an empty box in my lap, waiting for a man who had never once, in 4 years, given me reason to doubt his consistency, until, apparently, he had, quietly, for 2 of those 4 years, and simply never let me see it. 6 years after that hospital room, I sat on the edge of my bed with an empty box in my lap, waiting for my husband to come home and explain how the proof had disappeared. Daniel came home at 6:15, 15 minutes late, which I noted with the specific, absurd precision of a mind trying to control anything it can while the rest of the world falls apart. He stood in the doorway of our bedroom for a long moment before he came in, the way you stand at the edge of cold water before deciding to actually get in. "Before you say anything," he said, "I want you to know I was going to fix it. I was going to buy it back before you ever noticed it was gone." "How long has it been gone, Daniel?" He sat down on the very edge of the bed, as far from me as the mattress allowed, which felt, at the time, like its own kind of confession. 6 weeks, he said quietly. 6 weeks. I had opened that drawer exactly once in the last 6 weeks, 3 days after he must have taken it, to find a spare charging cable, and I hadn't looked inside the box, because why would I have? Because the box had never once, in 4 years of marriage, given me a reason to check. "Where is it?" I said. Not a question. I didn't have the emotional bandwidth left, by that point, for the rising inflection of an actual question. I pawned it, Daniel said. At a shop downtown. I have the ticket. I was going to buy it back, Josie, I swear to God, I just needed. He stopped himself, and something in his face shifted, the specific shift of a man realizing he was about to say the true thing instead of the rehearsed thing, and deciding, in that exact moment, that the true thing was going to come out whether he wanted it to or not. I needed the money. For a debt. A gambling debt. I want to describe the next few seconds as accurately as I can, because I've replayed them more times than almost any other moment in my life, trying to understand exactly when the floor actually gave way beneath me, whether it was the word pawned, or the word gambling, or the specific, casual way he said a debt, as though it were the kind of ordinary thing husbands sometimes mention to their wives on a Tuesday evening. A gambling debt, I repeated. It's not, I don't have a problem, Josie, it's not like that. It was a bad few months. Poker, mostly, some online stuff. I got in over my head with a group of guys from the gym, and it snowballed faster than I expected, and I panicked, and I saw the ring, and I told myself it was temporary, that I'd get it back before you ever. How much? I said. What? How much did you owe? How much was the debt that was worth my mother's ring? Daniel was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally answered, his voice had gone very small, the voice of a man who understood, perhaps for the first time in the conversation, exactly how badly this was going to land. $11,000, he said. I sat with that number for a long time. $11,000. Not an emergency. Not a medical bill, not a job loss, not any of the sympathetic catastrophes I might have, in some other version of this conversation, found a way to forgive. A card game. A snowballing series of bad decisions, hidden from me for months, resolved, in the end, by quietly removing the one object in our home that had survived 2 generations of women choosing not to sell it, even when they had far more legitimate reasons to. How long, I asked, has the gambling been happening? Not the debt. The actual gambling. How long has this been a thing you do? Daniel looked at his hands. On and off. A couple years, maybe. I know how that sounds. A couple years. My voice came out flatter than I expected, drained of the anger I'd braced for, replaced by something colder and considerably more useful. We've been married 4 years, Daniel. You're telling me you've had a gambling habit for half our marriage, and I'm only finding out about it because you sold my dead mother's ring to cover a debt you never once mentioned. I was going to tell you. I kept meaning to. Every time I thought about bringing it up, I convinced myself I'd get it under control first, that I'd tell you once it was already fixed, so you'd never have to actually worry about it. That's not honesty, Daniel. That's just delayed dishonesty. You didn't protect me from worrying. You protected yourself from having to face what I'd say. He didn't have an answer for that, which told me, more than anything else in the conversation, that I was right. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the guest room, the first night in 4 years of marriage that I chose, on my own, to sleep somewhere other than beside him, and made a different kind of list than the one I'd made on the bed that afternoon. Not a list of innocent explanations. A list of what I actually needed to know before I could decide what came next. The pawn shop was called Coldwater Exchange, tucked between a laundromat and a check-cashing storefront in a part of downtown I'd never had reason to visit. I went alone, on a Wednesday morning, with the pawn ticket Daniel had finally, shamefully, produced from his wallet. The man behind the counter was older, unhurried, with the specific weary courtesy of someone who had spent decades watching people's worst weeks pass through his register. "I'm looking for a ring," I said, sliding the ticket across the counter. "My husband pawned it 6 weeks ago. I'd like to buy it back, if it's still here." He checked the ticket against a logbook, and I watched his face do something careful and apologetic before he even spoke. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said. "That item sold 3 weeks ago. Once the hold period passes without redemption, we're within our rights to sell to a buyer. I have the sale logged, if it helps, but I can't tell you where it went from here. We don't track resale." I stood at that counter for a long moment, feeling something in my chest that I could only describe, later, as a very specific and very final kind of grief, not the grief of my mother's death, which had already happened and already been mourned, but a second, smaller grief stacked directly on top of it, the grief of losing the last physical proof that her survival had ever meant anything. "Do you remember who bought it?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "I remember it went to a private buyer," the man said carefully. "Someone who deals in estate pieces, resells them further up the chain. I couldn't tell you where it is now if my life depended on it." "I'm sorry." "I really am. I've been in this business 30 years, and I still hate this part of it." I thanked him and left, and sat in my car in the parking lot for 20 minutes before I felt steady enough to drive, and somewhere in those 20 minutes, I understood, with a clarity that felt almost like relief, that the ring was genuinely, permanently gone, and that the entire remaining question of my life was not how to get it back, but what I was going to do with a marriage built on a foundation I'd just discovered had been rotting quietly for years. I called my best friend, Marisol, that afternoon, and told her everything, sitting on my kitchen floor in the exact spot where, months later, I would come to associate with every major turning point of that entire year. "I need you to not tell me what to do yet," I said. "I just need you to listen first." "Okay," Marisol said. "I'm listening." I told her about the box. The pawn shop. The $11,000. The 2 years of gambling I hadn't known about. The specific, quiet devastation of learning that my husband had made a habit of hiding things from me and had only confessed this particular one because the evidence had physically disappeared from our bedroom. "Josie," Marisol said, when I finally finished, her voice careful and steady in the specific way of someone who loves you enough to say the hard thing gently. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to actually think about it before you answer. Has this happened before?" "Not the ring specifically. The pattern. Has he hidden things from you before and waited to confess until he had no other choice?" I thought about it, longer than I wanted to, and found, uncomfortably, that the answer was yes. Smaller things, over the years, a missed credit card payment he'd forgotten to mention, a cancelled vacation fund he'd quietly redirected into an investment opportunity that never materialized, a pattern I'd noticed at the time and explained away, each instance, as an isolated mistake rather than what it actually was, a rehearsal for exactly this moment. "I think I've been editing him," I said slowly, understanding it as I said it out loud for the first time. "I think I've spent 4 years quietly rewriting every warning sign into something smaller and more forgivable, because the alternative was admitting I'd built a life with someone I couldn't actually trust. That's not a character flaw, Josie. That's just what hope does to people. It's not stupid to want to believe the best about someone you love. It only becomes a problem when you keep doing it after the evidence stops supporting it." I sat with that for a long time after we hung up, in the particular quiet of a kitchen at 4 in the afternoon, and felt something in me shift from grief into something clearer, colder, and considerably more useful, the same shift, I would later realize, that had carried my mother through decades of choosing not to sell a ring she could have, at any point, cashed in for an easier life. There was a strange, unexpected coda to that week, one I hadn't anticipated at all, a phone call, a few days later, from Daniel's mother, Patricia, a woman I'd always gotten along with well enough, in the careful, cordial way of in-laws who like each other but have never quite become close. "Daniel told me what happened," Patricia said, her voice tight, and I braced myself, expecting the specific defensive loyalty mothers sometimes extend to their sons regardless of the facts. "Josie, I want you to know something, and I don't know if it will help or make things worse, but I think you deserve to know it either way." His father gambled. For most of our marriage. I spent 15 years covering debts I never told anyone about, telling myself it was a private family matter, that airing it would only shame him further. I thought I was protecting our family by staying quiet about it. I understand now, only in the last few years, that what I was actually doing was teaching my son that this is simply what wives do, absorb the damage, quietly, and keep the family's reputation intact. I never meant to teach him that. I don't think I even realized I was teaching him anything at all. But I look at what he did to you, and I see my own silence reflected back at me in a way I find very hard to sit with. I sat with that revelation for a long time after we hung up, turning it over, feeling the specific vertigo of understanding a pattern reaching back further than I'd ever imagined, not just Daniel's 2 years of hidden gambling, but an entire inherited architecture of secrecy, passed down quietly, generation to generation, disguised as loyalty. "I'm not calling to make excuses for him," Patricia added, before we hung up. "I called because I don't want you to spend the rest of your life thinking you should have seen this coming sooner, or that you failed some test you should have passed. You didn't fail anything, Josie. You were simply never given the full picture, by design, by 2 generations of men who learned that hiding things was easier than being honest about them. I'm sorry my family did that to you. I mean that completely. Daniel asked me to go to couples counseling 3 weeks after the pawn shop, and I agreed, not because I believed it would fix anything, but because I needed, for my own sake, to know whether I had genuinely exhausted every reasonable option before I let this marriage end, because I did not want to spend the rest of my life wondering if I'd walked away from something that could have been saved. The counselor, a calm, unhurried woman named Renata, asked good questions, the kind that didn't let either of us hide behind vague, comfortable language. "Daniel," she said, in our 3rd session, "I want you to describe, specifically, what you were feeling in the moment you decided to take the ring instead of telling Josie about the debt." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. "Panic," he said finally. "And shame. I think mostly shame. I didn't want her to know how bad it had gotten, because I was scared of what it would mean about me, if she knew. I told myself the ring was replaceable. That I could fix it before it mattered. I think, somewhere underneath all of that, I actually believed that protecting my own image was more important than being honest with her, and I didn't want to look at that directly, so I didn't." "That's the most honest thing you've said in 3 sessions, Renata said. "Josie, how does hearing that land for you?" "It lands," I said slowly, like someone finally describing accurately something I'd already understood but hadn't had the language for. He didn't take the ring because he had no other option. He took it because it was easier than facing me. That's not a crisis decision, Renata. That's a character decision. And I don't think a person's character changes just because he's finally said the true thing out loud in a room I'm paying to be in." Daniel flinched at that, visibly, and I watched him decide, in real time, whether to argue with it or sit with it, and I want to give him this much credit, he sat with it. "I understand why that's how it lands," he said quietly. "I don't know how to prove, in a room like this, that I'd actually be different going forward. I know saying it isn't the same as showing it. No, I agreed. It isn't. We went to 4 more sessions after that, and in each one, I watched Daniel say increasingly honest, increasingly difficult things, and I want to be fair to him, I believe every word he said in that office was true, in the moment he said it. I simply no longer believed that truth, on its own, was enough to rebuild something that required years of consistent action to actually repair, and somewhere around the 6th session, I understood that I wasn't attending counseling to save the marriage anymore. I was attending it to make sure I could leave without a single unanswered question following me out the door. There was one session, the 5th, that I still think about more than the others, because it was the moment I finally understood the actual shape of what had happened to us, rather than just the facts of it. I want to ask you both something, Renata said, turning first to Daniel. When you imagine the version of yourself who told Josie about the gambling the very first time it became a problem, not 6 weeks after the ring disappeared, but 2 years ago, the first time you felt the panic start, what stopped that version of you from existing? Daniel was quiet for a long moment. I think I was scared she'd see me differently, he said finally. Not just about the money. About who I was underneath it. I've always been the reliable one, in every relationship I've ever had, the fixer, the steady one. I didn't know who I'd be to her if she saw me as someone who needed to be fixed instead. Josie, Renata said, turning to me, what does it do to you, hearing that? It makes me sad for him, I admitted, genuinely, sincerely sad, in a way I didn't expect to still feel at this point. But it also confirms something I've been circling for weeks. He didn't hide it because he thought I couldn't handle the truth. He hid it because he'd built an entire identity around being the person who never needed handling, and admitting the gambling would have meant admitting that identity was never fully real. I don't think that's a fixable problem in 6 sessions, Renata. I think that's a foundational way of relating to the world, and I'm not confident 6 months of good intentions changes a foundation that took decades to set. Renata didn't try to talk me out of that reading, which told me, more than anything else in that room, that she agreed with it. I told Daniel I wanted a divorce on a Sunday morning, over coffee, at our own kitchen table, in the same unhurried, deliberate tone I imagined my mother might have used if she'd ever needed to say something this final. I'm not doing this because of the ring, I said. I want you to understand that clearly, because I think it would be easy for you to tell yourself, later, that you lost your marriage over a piece of jewelry, and that's not what happened. I'm doing this because the ring showed me something about you that I think, if I'm honest, I'd been quietly avoiding seeing for years. You hide things when they're hard. You wait until you have no other choice before you tell me the truth. And I don't think 6 therapy sessions undoes a pattern that took 2 years to build. I know I can't undo it in 6 sessions, Daniel said, and there were tears in his eyes now, real ones, and I believed them, and it still didn't change anything. But I'm asking you to give me the chance to prove it over more than 6 sessions. Over years, if that's what it takes. I believe you'd try, I said honestly. I don't doubt that you'd try, Daniel. But I don't want to spend the next 5 years of my life waiting to see if trying eventually becomes trustworthy. I want to build something now, with someone or by myself, that doesn't require me to wait and hope. I spent 4 years married to a man I didn't actually know as well as I thought I did. I don't want to spend the next 4 finding out whether I know him now. He didn't argue with that, in the end. I think some part of him had already known, sitting across that kitchen table, what I was going to say before I said it, and some other part of him, the honest part that had finally started showing up in Renata's office, understood that I was right. The year that followed was not, contrary to what a tidier version of this story might suggest, an immediate triumphant reinvention. It was slower than that, and uglier in places, and considerably more boring in the specific way that real healing usually is, compared to the version of it you see condensed into a highlight reel. I moved into a small apartment across town, furnished slowly, deliberately, with things I actually liked instead of things we'd compromised on together. I went to therapy on my own, separate from the couple's counseling, and spent most of the first 3 months simply learning to notice, in real time, the specific habit Marisol had named, the quiet, automatic editing I did to other people's behavior, softening things that deserved to stay sharp. I threw myself into my work. I managed the accounts department at a mid-size architecture firm, a job I'd always liked well enough but had never fully invested in, because some quiet, unexamined part of me had always assumed my real life was happening at home, in the marriage, and the job was simply the thing that funded it. Once the marriage ended, I found, almost by accident, that the job filled a space I hadn't realized was empty, and within a year I'd been promoted to a role overseeing 3 departments, a version of professional ambition I hadn't let myself want in a long time. I reconnected with old friends I'd let drift during the marriage, not because Daniel had ever asked me to choose him over them, but because I had, quietly, without ever quite noticing, let the marriage become the only relationship I invested real effort into, the way people sometimes do when the whole architecture of a life gets built around a single load-bearing wall. There was a particular Saturday, about 5 months into that year, when I drove out to visit my Aunt Ruth, my mother's younger sister, someone I'd seen only twice since the funeral, mostly out of the specific grief avoidance that makes you steer clear of anyone who reminds you too directly of what you've lost. Ruth lived 2 hours outside the city, in the same small house she and my mother had grown up visiting during summers as girls, and she greeted me at the door with the particular fierce, unbothered warmth of a woman who had never once, in her entire life, learned how to soften her opinions for anyone's comfort. "You look like you've been carrying something," she said, before I'd even gotten my coat off. "Sit down. Tell me." I told her everything, over tea that went cold twice because neither of us thought to microwave it, and when I finished, Ruth sat back in her chair and looked at me for a long moment with an expression I recognized, with a small shock, as identical to one of my mother's, the particular steady, assessing look she used when she was deciding exactly how much truth a person could handle in one sitting. "Your mother almost left your father twice before he finally left her," Ruth said. "Did you know that?" I hadn't known that. My mother had never once, in 28 years, mentioned it. "She stayed both times because she was afraid of exactly what you're afraid of right now," Ruth continued. "That leaving meant admitting she'd failed at something. That building a life alone meant she'd wasted the years she'd already put in. I watched her carry that fear for a decade, Josie, and I watched what it cost her, staying in something long after she'd stopped trusting the person she was staying with. I'm not going to tell you what to do. But I will tell you this, the version of your mother who eventually raised you alone, who worked 2 jobs and kept that ring anyway and built you into the woman sitting in my kitchen right now, was infinitely stronger than the version of her who stayed married out of fear. I think, if she were here, she'd want you to know that leaving isn't the failure. Staying somewhere that isn't safe, out of fear of what leaving says about you, that's the actual failure. And she'd know that better than almost anyone, because she lived both versions." I drove home that evening with the specific, hard-won clarity of someone who has just been handed a piece of family history they didn't know they needed, and I thought about it for weeks afterward, turning it over the way I used to turn the ring over in the light, not an object this time, but a truth, equally worth keeping. And I grieved, properly, for the first time, the ring itself, not just as an object, but as the specific, physical proof my mother had wanted me to carry forward, and I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that the grief eventually settled into something gentler than I expected. "I keep thinking I failed her," I told Marisol, about 8 months after the divorce was finalized, sitting on her back porch on a warm evening that felt, for the first time in a long while, uncomplicated. She asked me to keep it. I kept it for 6 years. And then I didn't. You didn't lose it, Josie, Marisol said. It was taken from you, by someone who chose himself over you and over her memory. That's not the same as failing to keep a promise. You kept the promise as long as it was yours to keep. What happened after that wasn't a failure of yours. It was a betrayal of his. I thought about my mother's actual words, the ones she'd said to me at 17, the ones I'd carried for years without fully understanding them until now. It isn't really a ring anymore. It's proof that our family survives things. I had survived this. Daniel hadn't taken that from me, even though he'd taken the ring. If anything, I understood now, sitting on Marisol's porch with a glass of wine going warm in my hand, that surviving this particular thing, the betrayal, the divorce, the year of slow, unglamorous rebuilding, was itself the proof my mother had been talking about all along. The ring had only ever been a symbol. I had just spent a year becoming the actual thing it symbolized. There is one more part of this story I want to tell, because I think it matters, even though it isn't the ending you might expect. About 14 months after the divorce, an old family friend, a woman named Constance, who had known my mother since they were girls, and who ran a small estate jewelry shop 3 states over, called me out of the blue on a Thursday evening. Josie, she said, and I could hear something careful and excited in her voice, the specific tone of someone who has been sitting on news they aren't sure how to deliver. I need you to sit down for this. I'm sitting. A ring came through my shop last week. Estate piece, second-hand, sold to me by a regional dealer who deals mostly in resale from pawn networks. The moment I saw it, I knew. Your grandmother's setting, Josie. The specific hallmark on the band, the exact cut of the stone. I'd know it anywhere. I sat next to your mother at her own engagement dinner, remember, back when we were both 22 and neither of us had any idea what our lives were going to look like. I bought it back the second I recognized it. I didn't even negotiate the price. I want you to have it. I sat in my apartment, phone pressed to my ear, and felt something enormous and complicated move through me, not simple joy, though there was joy in it, but something more layered than that, a strange, humbling collision of grief and relief and the specific vertigo of getting back something you'd already, painstakingly, taught yourself to live without. I don't know what to say, I told her honestly. Say you'll come get it, Constance said. And Josie, I want to say one more thing, and then I'll let you go process this. Your mother would be furious at that man. Genuinely furious, in a way I only saw her get maybe twice in the entire time I knew her. But she would also, I think, be enormously proud of what you did after. She didn't ask you to keep the ring because she cared about a diamond. She asked you to keep it because she wanted you to know you came from women who survived things. You did that, Josie. Whether or not the ring ever came back, you already did the thing she actually asked of you. I drove 3 hours the following weekend to collect it, and Constance's shop turned out to be smaller than I'd pictured, tucked into a converted storefront on a quiet street, with a single display case near the register and the specific hushed, careful quiet of a place that handled things people had loved for a long time before they ever arrived there. I want to tell you something before I give this back to you, Constance said, setting a small velvet box on the counter between us, new, not the same blue cloth my mother had always used, and I found myself absurdly grateful for that small detail, that this chapter of the ring story would begin, physically, in something that wasn't a reminder of the theft. Your mother sat in a shop very much like this one, 40 years ago, the day she and I first got our ears pierced together, both of us 17, both of us terrified of the needle. She held my hand through the whole thing and told me, and I remember this so clearly, that being scared of something didn't mean you got to skip it, it just meant you got to decide how you walked through it. I think about that a lot, watching what you've done this year. I don't imagine any of it felt brave while you were living it. But from where I'm sitting, looking at the woman who drove 3 hours to pick up a ring instead of falling apart over its loss, it looks exactly like what she'd call walking through it. I opened the box, and there it was, the same modest diamond, the same worn gold setting, sitting in new velvet instead of old, and I found that my hands, for the first time in 14 months, weren't shaking when I picked it up. "Try it on," Constance said gently. "Not to keep it on forever. Just to see how it sits, now." I slid it onto my right hand, and it fit exactly the way I remembered, the specific familiar weight of it settling against my finger, and I found myself laughing, unexpectedly, through tears I hadn't noticed starting. "What is it?" Constance asked. "I think I expected this to feel like getting something back," I said. "And it does, a little. But mostly it feels like meeting an old friend after a long time apart, and realizing you both changed, and the friendship still holds anyway." "I don't need this ring to feel whole anymore, Constance. I think that's what surprises me most. I already did the work of becoming whole without it. This just feels like a very beautiful bonus, arriving after the fact." "That," Constance said, "is exactly the woman your mother always hoped you'd become. I only wish she'd been here to see it." I drove home that evening with the ring back in its box, on the passenger seat beside me, and found I wasn't the same woman who had opened that empty box 14 months earlier. That woman had built her entire sense of safety around a marriage and an object, and had lost both within the same 6 weeks, and had needed, desperately, for one of them to come back in order to feel whole again. This woman, sitting in Constance's small shop, turning the ring in the afternoon light exactly the way her mother used to, understood that she had already become whole in the ring's absence, slowly, unglamorously, across 14 months of therapy and promotions and reconnected friendships and evenings on Marisol's porch, and that the ring's return was not the thing that completed her. It was simply a gift, arriving after the actual work was already done, a beautiful and entirely unnecessary confirmation of something she'd already proven to herself the hard way. I wear the ring now, on my right hand, not as an engagement ring, I'm not engaged, and I'm in no hurry to be, but as exactly what my mother always said it was, proof. Not proof that I deserve good things, exactly, though I've come to believe that too. Proof that the women in my family have always found a way through things that could have easily broken them, and that I am, whatever else has happened, unmistakably one of them. I heard, through the same industry grapevine that eventually tells you everything whether you want to know or not, that Daniel's gambling had continued after the divorce, that he'd gone through a second, larger debt within the following year, that he'd eventually sought treatment, real treatment, the kind that requires months of sustained, difficult work rather than 6 performative therapy sessions aimed at saving a marriage he was already losing. I hope, genuinely, that it helped him. I don't wish him harm. I simply no longer wish him anything at all, which I've come to understand as its own quiet, complete kind of peace, the specific peace of a person who has stopped needing an ending for someone else's story in order to feel settled in her own. Marisol asked me, on the 1-year anniversary of the divorce, sitting once again on her back porch, whether I regretted any of it, the marriage, the years invested, the version of myself who had waited too long to notice the pattern. No, I told her, and meant it completely. I think I needed to lose the ring to understand what it had actually been asking of me all along. Not to keep an object safe. To become someone who could survive its loss and still recognize herself afterward. I did that. I don't think I could have learned it any gentler way, and I wish I had, but I don't regret who I became getting here. There is a small, quiet postscript to all of this that I want to include, not because it changes the shape of the story, but because I think it matters to say plainly. About 18 months after the divorce, I started seeing someone, a man named Theo, a structural engineer I'd met through work, unremarkable in all the ways that turned out to matter most, steady in a fashion that didn't announce itself, consistent in the small unglamorous places where consistency actually gets tested. I told him about the ring on our fourth date, the whole story, start to finish, and watched him listen without once trying to fix it, minimize it, or rush me towards some tidier version of forgiveness. "I don't need you to explain why you're careful," he said, when I finished. "I just want you to know you're allowed to stay careful for as long as you need to. I'm not in a hurry for you to trust me. I'd rather earn it slowly and actually keep it, than rush it and lose it the way you already lost something once. I don't know yet where that relationship is going, and for the first time in my adult life, I found I don't need to know in advance. I've learned, this past year, that the not knowing isn't the same as the danger I used to think it was. Sometimes the not knowing is simply what patience looks like from the inside. I still keep the receipts of that year, in a manner of speaking, not literal papers, but the specific, permanent lessons of it, that hope is not the same as evidence, that patterns matter more than promises, that peace built on constant vigilance isn't peace at all, and that the people who truly love you don't ask you to keep quietly editing them into someone easier to forgive. The ring sits on my hand now, catching the light the way it must have caught the light on my grandmother's hand in 1958, on my mother's hand through 30 years of choosing, again and again, not to sell it even when selling it would have been easier. It is, as it always was, just a modest diamond in a worn gold setting. But I understand now, in a way I don't think I fully did before that empty box, exactly what it was always meant to prove. Not that I could keep something safe forever. That I could survive it not being safe, and still come out the other side entirely, unmistakably myself. So, was the ring ever really the point, or was it always about what I chose to become after losing it? Some of you are going to want Daniel punished further. Some of you are going to hope he's genuinely healed. Either way, tell me in the comments what peace means to you. If this story moved you, hit subscribe. New stories about betrayal, resilience, and rebuilding every week, and I'll see you in the next one.